All right, everyone, good evening. Today is Tuesday, November 10th, and let's walk through the market news of the day. To kick things off, as always, let's talk about equity markets. We saw a bit of strength in markets, particularly in the Dow. However, stark weakness in the NASDAQ. We saw the NASDAQ down about 2%. The Russell 2000 index of small caps climbed to the highest since August 2018, which shows an interesting rotation in terms of rates markets. Treasuries rose, Treasury yields rose, treasuries fell in terms of prices, with the 10-year rising in yield back to 97 basis points. This was a steepener day as well, with the 2's10 spread going all the way up to 77 basis points, which is the difference between the yield on the 2-year and 10-year treasury. So this was up about 2.25 basis points today. The dollar gained on Monday, did decide to steady today. However, the euro bought 118.22. The yen was at 105.22 per dollar. The offshore RMB was trading around 660 a dollar right now. Moving into the world of mortgage-backed securities, October marked another month of faster prepayment speeds and diverged from the pace of refi applications volume. This, not surprisingly, is something we've seen a lot of given the current rate environment, which has been buttressed by the Federal Reserve's provision for liquidity in the mortgage-backed securities capital markets arena. So we saw refi applications down about 7% this month. This does come amid stark increases in the last few months coming out of the COVID crisis. And again, because of the low rates we're seeing right now. In terms of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York's actions for providing liquidity, the Fed is likely to stop buying 1.5s, which are the 1.5 coupon UMBS, which is either the Fannie or Freddie securities, which are now uniform in the uniform mortgage-backed securities market. They're likely to focus more on the 2s because of the change in rates. We've seen, again, yields continue to rise as it is now confirmed that Biden is going to be our president. He has stated that he's going to be the president. News agencies have also confirmed this as an idea. However, current President Trump has not officially conceded and tweeted today that, quote unquote, in all caps, we will win. So more to unfold there, but it does look like a pretty clear verdict for a Biden election, and that is what's being priced into markets right now. The 1.5s did increase in the run-up to the election, however, have fallen a bit since on the rate movements. All right, also on the bottom of your screen, you see mention of oil. Oil prices are now to 2-month highs, with WTI trading up about 50 basis points on the December contract, which is that front month contract, to 41.57 a barrel. Gold held steady around the 1877 mark, coming in at 1877.93 an ounce. All right, general stories to talk about. Big one, antitrust. We have Amazon sinking today as the online retail giant and hegemon in consumer products here in the US has faced an antitrust complaint from the European Union. This comes amid the possibility of a blue wave, depending on what happens in the Senate and the ongoing hearings for antitrust here in the US. For big companies, big tech companies, rather, more broadly. Also, abroad, American depository receipts of Alibaba Group tumbled after China tightened the scrutiny of internet behemoths. This includes companies like Alibaba and Tencent, the big names in Chinese tech. Alibaba's biggest event of the year is something called Singles Day on 11/11, named aptly because there are a lot of ones in that day, which is a made-up retail holiday that they use to kind of essentially do the same thing as Black Friday here in the US. This online shopping day will happen tomorrow or today right now out in Asia, and will provide insight into the recovery of the Chinese consumer with online shopping. All right, moving on to what you can actually see on your screen, let's talk about equity raises for distressed companies. These are 3 companies that have been hit particularly hard by the pandemic, with the AMC chain of movie theaters Carnival Cruise Lines, and American Airlines being under immense duress. AMC Entertainment seeks to raise about 70 million US dollars amid vaccine hopes, and Goldman Sachs and B. Riley Financial will manage the 20 million share offering. Shares closed Tuesday, today at about $3.51 a share. This comes off a record low of $2.11, and the stock was up about 50% on Monday, with the news of Pfizer's vaccine likely going through. Anthony Fauci did come up and say that by the end of next week, we could get more news on the efficacy, which would be, not surprisingly, great for financial markets. And also, more importantly, the public health concerns that do still persist. Stock was down about 3.1% on the news of the filing. And if this does go through, it will add much needed reserves to AMC's cash balance. This stood at about 430 million at the end of the third quarter. And AMC has a huge rate of cash burn. They're running through about $100 million a month, which is a big problem. So they need this money to stay afloat until the summer, which is when the CEO came out and said that they expect Hollywood studios to release delayed 2020 films. So with regard to this cash burn, that's a big reason that they need to raise either equity or debt, because they've already raised a lot of debt. And for them, given their credit risk, it is very expensive. They're now looking to also raise equity. Wallace had actually advised on a restructuring of parts of their capital structure back in early June as well. AMC bonds were among some of the top gainers in the US high yield market this week. They're one of the few bonds in the high yield category that do actually still trade at incredibly high yields. We see them priced in market at 10.5%, which is pretty crazy for something due in 2025, which is a relatively midterm maturity. They were up nearly 4 cents on the dollar to a price of 72 cents today. All right, next equity raise to talk about for a distressed company is Carnival Cruise Lines. They're joining American Airlines in cashing in on this rally from the vaccine on Monday. So Carnival is the world's largest cruise company. Not surprisingly, means it's been very exposed to what has been going on. They filed to sell as much as $1.5 billion US dollars in stock in New York after the surge on Monday. They recently completed the sale of 67.1 million common shares under a similar program, but given that this obviously will be dilutive, this brought the price of shares down by about 12%. All right, one more. American Airlines, they separately priced an offering for about 500 million US dollars in common stock at $13 a share. So shares did fall about 5.3% on the news. This comes after being down 56% this year amid travel concerns and difficulties there. Airbnb is also delaying its IPO and could file as early as Monday. It had earlier intended to file this Thursday, is delayed on the basis of election instability. As previously mentioned, President Trump has not yet acknowledged Biden's victory and does say that he is going to challenge it. There are 5 key battleground states that he is going to apparently look for recounts or legal recourse in, and we'll stay tuned to that as it unfolds. Airbnb is planning to raise as much as $3 billion in their NASDAQ-listed IPO. This is coming after a tough year, like lots of other companies in the sector, with both bookings plummeting and revenue tumbling. We see a bounce back faster than expected over the summer, and bookings were down only a mere 30% year over year compared to the same month. And the firm did cut a quarter of its staff in May, with reservations down about 70% from a year prior. Also, on that same line, we see SpaceX winning NASA's formal blessing to ferry astronauts to the space station. This is a key milestone for commercial space vehicles and comes about 3 months after successfully completing a crewed test mission. This certification will enable SpaceX to have their Dragon capsule and their Falcon 9 rocket begin regular crew rotations to the orbiting lab. The next flight is planned for November 14th with 4 astronauts on board. NASA granted final approval after a 2-day thorough flight readiness review that did finish today. And the SpaceX vehicles are going to be the first that the US agency has approved since the space shuttle. So the SpaceX first operational flight is scheduled for 7:49 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on Saturday, and docking is expected about 8.5 hours later. Moving on, Spotify agrees to buy a company called Megaphone, which is a subsidiary of Slate, which in turn is a subsidiary of Graham Holdings. So Spotify is buying this podcast ad technology company, which was founded by Slate to connect podcast publishers such as Fox and ESPN and other big names, networks of advertisers to make more money from this growing business. So this music streaming giant Spotify has now spent over $800 million acquiring podcast firms, including Gimlet Media, Anchor, and The Ringer. Podcasts have now generated about 708 million US dollars in advertising sales in the US alone last year, and does continue to grow consistently and looks to accelerate in the coming years. Spotify shares, given the work from home environment, are up 83% this year, but did fall 3% on the news to $266.11. All right, last one on the screen. Lebanese central bank will announce a digital currency that could start as early as the beginning of 2021. Lebanon is going to use this digital currency to restore confidence in the banking sector and transition into a cashless system. He urged banks to begin restructuring and increasing recaps by 20%, and says that Lebanon does not have any natural resources like a lot of the other countries in the Middle Eastern region who are very much blessed to have huge supplies of oil. So they have to keep the gold. With this in mind, creating a digital currency could alleviate some of the pressures there and allows gold to continue to be an asset that they can have and liquidate whenever they want into foreign markets if they face an inevitable, fateful crisis, according to the governor there. All right, let's talk about New Zealand. Yesterday, in brief, we mentioned the Japanification of New Zealand debt. So it'd be useful to talk about this a bit more. We've seen skyrocketing ownership by the Bank of New Zealand, and this has led analysts to make parallels to Japan. This debt is 37% owned by the Royal Bank of New Zealand. And this ownership of the outstanding nominal government bonds has rocketed from a mere 6% just 7 months ago, going into the coronavirus crisis. Japanification is reflected in the fall of Japanese debt, which has halved since the Bank of Japan stepped up its quantitative easing in April 2013. However, in 2016, the Bank of Japan did rotate into using yield curve control, YCC, as opposed to using a quantitative easing target, amid concern that it would run out of bonds to buy and end up basically buying all of the bonds that were issued by the Treasury. Liquidity as a result of this has diminished by about 1/3, and the benchmark 10-year yield has dropped by 0.5 percentage point. This is in Japan. The Bank of Japan now owns about 48% of the outstanding sovereign debt. And back in New Zealand, volatility in the 10-year notes has already fallen by about 2/3 from a year prior, as denoted by the orange line on the right chart on your screen. RBNZ, the Royal Bank of New Zealand's debt holdings, are climbing steadily, and it is not given that they will continue the current pace of purchases. However, the government agreed to raise the central bank's cap on purchases to 60% of the market, which is a huge percentage. Rising debt sales may keep this below for the duration of its current program. However, it is targeting a whopping 100 billion New Zealand dollars of bond purchases by June 2022. The bank will be absorbing all of the new net supply by June 2022, and the free float in the market will remain around where it was before the pandemic. Foreign buyers have historically been the biggest buyers of these bonds, which could be problematic if the Royal Bank of New Zealand does end up holding 60%, which is their now current cap. All right, looking ahead, going into Thursday, we see Asian stocks opening higher. Yeah, futures are still up across the board. Japan and Australia are up about more than 1% right now. And the ECB President Christine Lagarde, the Bank of England Governor Andrew Bailey, and the Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell will be speaking at an online ECB forum on Thursday, which will walk through how central banks are adapting to a shifting world. The US CPI data for October is also due Thursday morning, so we will definitely touch on that Thursday evening. And both finance ministers and central bankers alike from the group of 20 will hold something called an extraordinary meeting, which basically just means it was not pre-scheduled, on Friday to discuss better actions to help poor nations that are struggling to repay their debts right now. So we have a busy week ahead of us. In the meantime, please don't hesitate to stay up to date with markets. Reach out to me with any questions and stay tuned for the next episode on Thursday. Thank you so much and have a great rest of your evening.